In the first 3 seconds of arrival, the prison decided who was human and who was property, and Ethan Cole learned he belonged to neither. The gates of Blacksite Meridian opened with a slow metallic breath, releasing a wave of cold air that carried the scent of rusted steel and recycled oxygen. Ethan stepped forward with a sealed ration crate under one arm, his boots grinding against frost-covered gravel that never seemed to thaw under the artificial gray sky. Above him, surveillance drones hovered like patient eyes, tracking every movement without blinking. He didn't look up. He had learned long ago that looking up meant noticing things you couldn't unsee. Inside the camp, the world moved in silence broken only by mechanical announcements and distant shifting of heavy doors. Prisoners lined in rigid rows, their identities reduced to codes glowing faintly on wristbands. Ethan's assignment was simple on paper, medical logistics support, but nothing about this place felt simple. Everything here was measured, controlled, stripped of excess humanity until only function remained. That was when he saw her. Seraphine Cade stood near the processing platform, her violet skin dulled under the harsh white floodlights, her posture held upright not by strength, but by refusal to collapse. 2 guards stood at distance, not touching her, not needing to. She was already contained. Her expression wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something quieter, something worn down by repetition. Ethan paused without meaning to. A moment too long. A mistake. The camp noticed. A scanner chirped softly, as if marking the irregularity of his attention. He adjusted the ration crate in his grip and continued forward, but the image of her stayed behind his eyes like a static imprint. Later, inside the supply corridor, he learned her designation from a passing data slate. Asset Transfer Unit 9, Unsanctioned Royal Derivative, Pending Reallocation. The words meant nothing in isolation, but together they carried weight that didn't need explanation. She was not a prisoner in the way humans understood it. She was something else, something owned by systems too large to argue with. Ethan exhaled slowly, setting the ration crate down on a cold metal table as the overhead lights flickered once, twice, like they were deciding whether to stay on. Across the corridor window, he saw her again being escorted past a narrow observation lane. This time, her eyes moved slightly and met his through reinforced glass. No plea, no accusation, just recognition that someone had noticed she existed. That was the moment everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet pressure of gravity changing direction. Ethan didn't move toward her. Not yet. Instead, he stood still as the camp continued its routine, unaware that something had already broken in its pattern. And far deeper inside the system, alarms that had not yet sounded were already beginning to wake. The following cycle of the prison camp began like all the others, with artificial dawn lights slowly brightening the steel-gray horizon and the hum of systems waking up in precise synchronization, as if the entire facility had been trained to pretend it was alive. Ethan Cole moved through the logistics corridor with measured steps, carrying a sealed medical supply case, while the floor beneath him vibrated faintly from underground generators maintaining life support for thousands of beings who had no say in where they stood. He kept his expression neutral, as he always did, but something had shifted inside him since the moment he first saw her in the processing lane. Seraphine Cade's image lingered in his thoughts like an unresolved calculation. Not pity, not curiosity alone, something closer to recognition. Inside the supply bay, he checked inventory lists displayed on a worn handheld terminal, noting shortages in hydration packs and thermal wraps assigned to non-human detainees. The numbers were precise, but the reality behind them never felt that clean. A technician nearby commented casually about upcoming redistribution schedules, but Ethan only nodded without engaging, his attention drawn instead to the small window overlooking the outer holding sector. From there, he could see movement in the distance, structured and controlled, yet somehow fragile in its repetition. Later that morning, protocol required him to deliver supplemental nutrition units to Section C, a zone designated for non-standard biological profiles. He walked alone, passing sealed corridors where voices echoed faintly through reinforced partitions, each one indistinct but undeniably present, like reminders that silence here was always manufactured. When he reached the distribution point, he paused briefly as Seraphine was brought into view again, this time positioned near a diagnostic station. Her posture remained composed, though there was a stillness about her that suggested endurance rather than comfort. No restraints were visible, only observation fields and scanning equipment that pulsed softly with calibration lights. Ethan placed the supply case on the counter and, after a moment that felt longer than it should have, adjusted the contents to include an additional ration pack not listed on the manifest. It was a violation of procedure small enough to go unnoticed, but he was aware that systems like this did not forget anomalies even when they did not react immediately. As he moved to leave, Seraphine's gaze shifted slightly toward him again. This time, there was something new in her expression, not trust, not yet, but the beginning of questioning stability in a world that had taught her none could exist. "You are not like the others," she said quietly, her voice filtered through translation software embedded in the station's environmental system. Ethan hesitated at the threshold of the corridor. He did not turn fully toward her, but he did not walk away either. "I am still here," he replied simply, as if that explained everything. Behind them, the camp continued its operations without pause, unaware of the subtle deviation forming within its structure. In the distance, an administrative alert flickered once on a control panel before disappearing without acknowledgement, as though even the system itself was unsure whether what it had detected was worth naming. And for the first time since arriving, Ethan Cole understood that survival in this place was no longer just about endurance, but about the quiet, dangerous act of noticing someone the system had already decided not to see. The third cycle of operations began with a system announcement that echoed through every corridor of the prison camp, not as a warning, but as a reminder that time itself here was regulated by something larger than human or alien awareness. Ethan Cole stood near the edge of the medical supply depot, watching as automated drones descended in slow, deliberate patterns to deliver sealed containers to different sectors. Each container represented a life reduced to measurable need, and each delivery route was calculated with mechanical precision that left no room for deviation. He checked his handheld terminal again, though he already knew the schedule by memory now, as if repetition had etched it directly into his mind. Seraphine Cade was assigned to Observation Wing 7 today, a designation that carried no explanation but suggested continued monitoring rather than interaction. Ethan moved with the flow of assigned personnel, his presence unremarkable among technicians and guards who treated the facility as routine rather than consequence. Yet every step he took carried a weight that was not recorded in any system. When he arrived at the observation wing, the environment shifted subtly. The lighting was softer here, though not by design, but by aging infrastructure that had not been fully replaced. Through reinforced glass panels, he could see her seated alone in a contained evaluation space, her posture steady but quiet, as though she had learned that movement invited attention she did not want. A diagnostic array hovered near her, projecting shifting lines of data that translated her biological state into charts and symbols Ethan barely understood without stopping to analyze them. A nearby technician noted casually that her readings were stable but unremarkable, as if stability itself had become a form of invisibility. Ethan did not respond. Instead, he reviewed the feed more carefully, noticing small irregularities in how the system categorized her responses. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger alarms, but enough to suggest that the system was not interpreting her correctly, only reducing her into simplified assumptions. As he observed, Seraphine's eyes lifted slightly, meeting his reflection through the glass. It was not a direct connection, but it was close enough to feel intentional. Ethan hesitated, then activated the terminal interface that controlled supplemental resource distribution. Without authorization prompt or external input, he adjusted her hydration schedule by a minimal margin, just enough to improve consistency without drawing automated correction flags. The action took less than a second, but it carried the same weight as a decision made in silence that could not be undone. Behind him, footsteps approached, but no one questioned his presence or his behavior. The system itself remained indifferent, or perhaps simply unaware that anything meaningful had changed. Inside the observation space, Seraphine shifted slightly as a new supply indicator appeared on her terminal display. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly, not to relief, but to awareness that the pattern of neglect had been interrupted. Ethan watched this reaction carefully, understanding without fully explaining to himself that recognition was the first fracture in systems built on invisibility. A distant alert flickered briefly across a control console in another sector, registering a minor inconsistency in allocation logs before clearing automatically. No investigation followed. No correction was initiated. But Ethan felt it anyway, the subtle sensation that something within the structure of the camp had begun to notice him in return. And as Seraphine continued to watch him through layers of glass and protocol, the space between observer and observed narrowed just enough to suggest that neither of them would remain unchanged for much longer. The moment the camp shifted from routine into something slightly uncertain was so small that most systems did not register it. But Ethan Cole felt it like a change in pressure inside a sealed room where the air was no longer evenly controlled. It began during the next scheduled supply cycle when he was assigned to direct distribution near the outer holding corridors, a place where sound traveled farther than it should and silence felt heavier than structure. He carried the same ration case as always, but this time he noticed the way personnel avoided standing too long in one position, as if stillness itself had become suspicious. Seraphine Cade was brought through the corridor again, this time not for observation but for routine recalibration checks, her movements guided by procedural escorts who spoke to her only when necessary and never longer than required. Ethan remained at his station, appearing fully integrated into the system, yet his attention followed her with quiet persistence that no longer felt accidental. When she passed the distribution point, her gaze did not search for him immediately, but it found him anyway, as if she had begun to recognize patterns rather than faces. A technician beside him mentioned that her compliance scores remained stable, though something in the tone suggested that stability in this case was not interpreted as success, but as absence of change. Ethan opened the ration case and followed protocol. Yet this time he added a thermal nutrient packet designed for recovery maintenance, something normally reserved for post-evaluation subjects, not active detainees. The system did not react instantly. It processed. It compared. It hesitated in ways that were not visible, but could be felt in the delay between action and acknowledgement. When Seraphine was seated briefly near the intake station, the escort personnel stepped away just far enough to maintain procedure, but not attention. Ethan approached only within assigned operational distance, placing the ration tray down with deliberate neutrality. She looked at the food for a long moment before speaking, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of someone measuring whether reality could be trusted. "You continue to adjust outcomes that are not assigned to you," she said through the facility translator system. Ethan did not correct her wording. He only replied with a tone that avoided both justification and apology. "Assignments are not the same as needs." The phrase lingered between them longer than expected. Seraphine studied him with a focus that was no longer passive observation but structured evaluation, as if she was rebuilding her understanding of what human behavior could contain. She reached for the ration packet but paused just before contact, not from fear, but from hesitation shaped by repetition of expectation rather than instinct. Around them, the camp continued its regulated rhythm, lights cycling, doors sealing, systems confirming status without deviation. Yet Ethan noticed something new, not in the environment, but in the way she held stillness differently now, as if stillness was no longer surrender, but consideration. As he turned slightly to leave, a low administrative tone echoed through the corridor announcing minor recalibration across multiple sectors, an automated correction triggered by inconsistencies in resource flow. No alarms followed. No personnel reacted. But Ethan understood that somewhere within the structure, something had recorded him more precisely than before. Seraphine did not call out, but her voice followed him just enough to stop him at the edge of departure. "If you continue this pattern," she said quietly, "they will eventually classify you as an anomaly." Ethan paused without turning fully back. "Then they will have to decide what kind of anomaly I am," he replied. And as he walked away, leaving her with the ration tray untouched for only a moment longer than necessary, neither of them noticed that the system had already begun to adjust how it categorized proximity between them, not as error, but as emerging correlation. The fifth cycle began without announcement, as if the prison camp had decided that change should not be declared but simply allowed to happen in silence. Ethan Cole noticed it first not in the systems themselves, But in the absence of expected rigidity, a subtle looseness in how routes were assigned and how personnel moved between sectors with slightly less certainty than before. He walked through the central logistics corridor carrying no additional supplies beyond his assigned medical crate. Yet the weight of his presence now felt different, as though the structure around him had begun to measure him more frequently than before. Seraphine Cade was scheduled for extended monitoring in Observation Wing 7 again, but the designation no longer felt like routine. It felt repeated in a way that suggested comparison. When Ethan arrived at the wing, he observed something new in the environment. The diagnostic systems were still active, but the data streams now included additional layers of cross-referencing, pulling information not only from her biological readings, but from interaction logs that previously did not exist as formal categories. He remained at the edge of the viewing corridor, watching as she sat within the evaluation chamber under soft illumination that made the space feel less like containment and more like controlled pause. She noticed him almost immediately this time, not by movement, but by presence, as if her awareness had adjusted to include him as part of the environment rather than an external anomaly. A technician nearby reviewed the updated system interface and commented that cross-sector behavioral correlation mapping had been activated as part of standard optimization protocols, though the phrasing carried the kind of uncertainty that suggested the protocol itself had not been widely tested. Ethan placed his ration logs on a nearby console and reviewed the updated assignment feed. There were minor inconsistencies in allocation distribution across 3 sectors, all statistically insignificant on their own, but collectively forming a pattern that suggested recalibration rather than random fluctuation. He did not report the anomaly. Instead, he adjusted one additional resource line item, extending thermal stabilization support across Seraphine's observation schedule by a narrow margin that would not trigger immediate correction thresholds. The system paused for approximately 1.3 seconds longer than previous cycles before accepting the change. Inside the chamber, Seraphine received the updated allocation notification and remained still for a moment longer than usual. Her expression shifted slightly, not toward confusion but toward analysis, as if she had begun to understand that the system governing her environment was no longer entirely consistent in its expectations. When Ethan moved closer to the interface window, she spoke without turning her head fully toward him. "Your actions are creating measurable deviation," she said, her voice steady and controlled through the translator system. Ethan responded without hesitation, his tone neutral but no longer entirely detached. "Deviation only matters when the baseline is correct." A brief silence followed, during which neither of them moved, yet the space between them felt increasingly defined by something neither system nor protocol had formally named. Seraphine finally turned her gaze toward him fully, studying him with an intensity that suggested she was no longer only observing behavior, but beginning to test intent. "Then you are suggesting the baseline is incorrect," she said. Ethan did not answer immediately. Outside the observation chamber, the camp continued its structured operations, unaware that its internal models were quietly recalculating relational probabilities between assigned personnel and detainee units. Somewhere deep within the administrative core, a system flag activated briefly, labeling Ethan Cole not as a disruption, but as a potential anchor point for emergent behavioral divergence. No alarm sounded. No corrective action followed. But in the quiet between operational cycles, both Ethan and Seraphine stood on opposite sides of a glass threshold that no longer felt like separation alone, but like the beginning of something the system had not yet learned how to define. The 6th cycle did not begin with a system announcement or a visible change in protocol, but with something far more subtle that Ethan Cole only noticed because he had begun paying attention to things the system assumed were too small to matter. The prison camp continued its regulated operations under artificial daylight, corridors filled with controlled movement and silent compliance. Yet the internal rhythm had shifted in ways that were no longer random. Resource distribution logs now updated in intervals that were slightly uneven, not enough to trigger alerts, but enough to create a measurable pattern when viewed over time. Ethan stood in the logistics control corridor reviewing updated assignment data when he realized that Seraphine Cade's observation schedule had been modified again, not by a directive from command, but through automated system suggestion based on behavioral correlation mapping. The phrase itself felt neutral on paper, but in practice it meant the system was beginning to treat interaction as data worth preserving rather than noise to be filtered. He carried out his assigned duties with the same measured discipline as always, yet his actions now included small, deliberate adjustments that no longer felt isolated. Each ration update he approved, each minor correction he applied to thermal and hydration cycles, now connected into a larger invisible structure that was slowly forming without explicit design. When he arrived at Observation Wing 7, Seraphine was already present within the chamber, seated in a position that suggested familiarity rather than restraint. The lighting system had been adjusted slightly, producing a softer gradient across the room, and Ethan immediately recognized that this change had not been manually requested. It had been inferred. She looked up as he entered the viewing corridor, and for the first time there was no hesitation in her recognition of him. It was immediate, as if the system between them had shortened the distance without permission. A technician nearby reviewed system diagnostics and noted that cross-sector interaction models were now being weighted into environmental comfort calibration, a development that was described in official logs as experimental optimization but spoken aloud as something closer to uncertainty. Ethan placed a new set of ration data onto the interface terminal, then paused for a fraction longer than protocol required before confirming distribution to Seraphine's unit. The system processed the adjustment and responded with a delay that was almost imperceptible but no longer invisible to him. Inside the chamber, Seraphine received the updated allocation without looking at the display first. Instead, she looked at Ethan. "The structure around this place is adapting to your behavior," she said calmly through the translator interface. Ethan did not deny it. He only observed the diagnostic readouts in silence before replying. "Or it is revealing how rigid it was before anything changed it." Her expression shifted slightly, not toward agreement, but toward deeper examination, as if she was testing whether his perspective was stable or still forming. "If that is true," she said, "then you are not simply interacting with the system. You are becoming part of how it defines itself." Ethan finally turned his attention fully toward her. The glass between them no longer felt like a barrier that separated roles, but like a surface that measured proximity rather than prevented it. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The camp continued its structured cycles in the background, unaware that multiple internal subsystems had begun flagging the same anomaly under different classifications without reaching consensus on what it meant. Somewhere in the administrative core, a silent update propagated across monitoring layers, adjusting how interaction frequency between Ethan Cole and Seraphine Cade was categorized, not as violation, not as compliance, but as emergent relational stability under observation. No alarms activated. No interventions were issued. Yet within the quiet precision of the system, something had begun to stabilize around a pattern it could no longer ignore, and both of them stood at its center without fully understanding what it was becoming. The seventh cycle began with an administrative silence that felt heavier than all previous operational updates, as if the system itself had entered a state of reconsideration without announcing it. Ethan Cole noticed it first in the way corridor lights across the prison camp adjusted their timing by a fraction of a second, not enough to disrupt function, but enough to introduce imperceptible irregularity into what had always been absolute synchronization. He moved through the logistics sector carrying standard medical distribution records, yet even the routine act of checking allocations now revealed layered annotations that had not existed in prior cycles. Seraphine Cade's designation had been updated again, this time shifting from observational monitoring to a classification labeled as interactive behavioral anchor subject, a term that carried no explicit directive but implied structural importance within the system's evolving model. Ethan did not react outwardly, but internally he recognized that something fundamental had changed in how the system defined relevance. When he reached Observation Wing 7, the atmosphere felt subtly different, not in physical structure, but in operational tone. The diagnostic arrays were still active, but their outputs now included predictive modeling extensions that projected possible interaction outcomes between Ethan and Seraphine across extended time intervals measured in hours rather than moments. Inside the chamber, she sat with the same composed stillness, yet her awareness of him had clearly deepened. She no longer tracked his presence as an external anomaly, but as a consistent variable within her environment. A technician nearby reviewed system logs and noted that adaptive modeling had begun integrating detainee response variability into environmental stabilization protocols, though the phrasing suggested that the system was now learning from itself in ways that were not fully documented. Ethan placed updated supply confirmations onto the terminal interface and paused longer than protocol required before validating Seraphine's resource cycle extension. The system processed the input and responded with a delay that had become familiar, no longer random, but increasingly structured. Inside the chamber, Seraphine observed him without looking away, her voice calm when she finally spoke through the translator system. "The system no longer treats your actions as isolated events," she said. "It is constructing continuity around them." Ethan considered this for a moment, his gaze remaining steady on the interface readouts. "Continuity only exists when something persists long enough to be measured," he replied. She studied him carefully, as if testing whether his response was philosophical or operational. "Then you are saying persistence is what defines meaning here," she said. Ethan did not immediately answer. Instead, he observed the subtle recalibration patterns unfolding across multiple diagnostic layers, each one quietly acknowledging the same relationship dynamics without explicitly naming them. "I am saying," he finally responded, "that systems built on observation eventually begin to observe themselves through what they choose to track." A brief silence followed, not empty but weighted, as though both of them were recognizing that the boundary between subject and system was no longer clearly defined. In the distance, a sector-wide synchronization pulse initiated without announcement, causing every monitoring unit in the facility to align its update cycle within a narrower variance than before. No alerts triggered, no warnings displayed. Yet within the administrative core, a new classification tier was automatically generated and assigned provisional status, marking interaction patterns between Ethan Cole and Seraphine Cade as structurally significant to system stability modeling. Neither of them saw the update. Neither of them needed to. Because at that moment, standing on opposite sides of reinforced glass and converging logic, both had already become part of something the prison system had begun to treat not as anomaly, but as architecture. The eighth cycle began without system initiation, as though the prison camp had entered a state where routine no longer required permission to evolve. Ethan Cole noticed at the moment he stepped into the logistics control corridor, where the ambient lighting no longer followed strict interval synchronization, but instead adjusted itself in response to fluctuating activity density across sectors. The change was subtle enough that most personnel continued operating without awareness, yet for Ethan it registered as a structural deviation in how the environment interpreted presence. His assigned terminal displayed updated behavioral mapping layers, and Seraphine Cade's classification had shifted again, now labeled as relationally adaptive subject under continuous environmental feedback monitoring. The terminology had become increasingly complex, but its implication was simple. The system was no longer just observing interaction. It was integrating it. When Ethan arrived at Observation Wing 7, he immediately recognized that procedural spacing had changed. The corridor leading to the chamber was no longer treated as neutral transit space, but as a regulated transition zone, with biometric scanning nodes that recorded microvariations in proximity response. Inside the chamber, Seraphine stood instead of sitting, positioned near the central interface panel where environmental data streams were now visible in real time rather than delayed summaries. This alteration alone indicated that her access level had been adjusted without formal authorization logs visible to standard personnel. Ethan approached the viewing interface, but before he could initiate standard input procedures, the system auto-populated his credentials with elevated interaction permissions that neither he nor any supervisor had explicitly requested. He paused for a fraction of a second longer than usual, then continued. Seraphine turned toward him immediately, her attention no longer requiring visual confirmation of his arrival. "They are no longer pretending your presence is incidental," she said through the translator system, her voice steady but carrying a tone of measured awareness. Ethan reviewed the updated interface layers. "The system does not usually abandon its own definitions without cause," he replied. She stepped closer to the transparent boundaries separating them, observing the shifting data fields that now included both of their interaction histories as continuous variables rather than isolated records. Then it is not abandoning them, she said quietly. It is refining them around us. Ethan did not dispute the interpretation. Instead, he observed the increasing density of correlation indicators forming across multiple subsystems, each one reinforcing the same conclusion from different analytical perspectives. Environmental stabilization metrics, resource distribution efficiency, and detainee psychological output all now included cross-referenced interaction markers between him and Seraphine as contributing factors to system equilibrium projections. A technician nearby reviewed the same feed and noted that predictive modeling outputs had begun generating long-range stability forecasts based on sustained interpersonal continuity, a concept previously absent from prison optimization frameworks. Ethan placed a standard supply update into the terminal, but the system responded before he could finalize confirmation, auto-adjusting allocation parameters across multiple sectors with reference to his historical input patterns. It was no longer waiting for instruction. It was responding to expectation. Inside the chamber, Seraphine observed the change without surprise. It is learning from repetition, she said. Not just behavior, but consequence. Ethan finally turned fully toward her. The glass between them no longer felt like separation in the traditional sense, but like a measurement surface recording alignment between two evolving variables. Then repetition becomes influence, he said. She nodded slightly, as if confirming a conclusion she had already reached independently. And influence becomes structure, she added. For a brief moment, neither of them moved or spoke. The prison camp continued its regulated cycles beyond the chamber, yet within the system architecture, multiple predictive modules initiated silent recalibration sequences. Interaction density thresholds were revised upward without formal notification. Stability outputs were reweighted. And a new classification layer emerged, marking their connection not as anomaly, not as deviation, but as foundational correlation within environmental optimization modeling. Neither Ethan nor Seraphine saw the designation appear. But in the quiet precision of a system built on control, something irreversible had already begun to treat their continued presence as necessary rather than accidental. The final cycle did not begin with a signal, because by this point the system no longer required formal initiation to continue evolving. It only required continuity. Ethan Cole recognized the change the moment he stepped into the logistics corridor and found that the interface terminals had already preloaded predictive interaction models before any manual input had been registered. The prison camp itself felt less like a static structure and more like a recalculating organism, with environmental systems adjusting in real time based on relational stability metrics that now included him and Seraphine Cade as a continuous paired variable. When he reached Observation Wing 7, there was no longer any distinction between scheduled monitoring and active engagement, because the chamber protocols had merged both into a unified state of adaptive observation. Seraphine stood at the center of the room, no longer positioned as a subject under review, but as a focal point within the system's predictive modeling architecture. Data streams flowed around her in layered projections, displaying not only biological metrics, but projected interaction outcomes extending into future timeframes that no longer defined her as isolated, but as inherently connected to external influence vectors. Ethan approached the interface barrier, and for the first time the system did not delay or question his access. It simply extended full interaction clearance, as if his presence had already been validated through prior outcomes rather than prior authorization. Seraphine turned toward him immediately, her awareness synchronized with his arrival not through observation, but through anticipation, as if the system had already informed her that he would be there before he physically arrived. "It is no longer tracking us separately," she said through the translator system, her voice calm but precise. "It is treating us as a single operational pattern." Ethan reviewed the interface diagnostics, where multiple subsystem layers confirmed her statement without contradiction. Resource allocation, environmental calibration, behavioral prediction, and stability forecasting had all converged into a unified model that referenced their interaction history as a primary stabilizing factor within the entire facility. The system does not merge variables unless it determines separation is less efficient than continuity, Ethan replied, his tone controlled but increasingly aware of the implication behind the data. Seraphine stepped closer to the boundary, not in confinement response, but in deliberate examination of the interface that now treated proximity as expected rather than exceptional. Then we are no longer being observed as individuals, she said. We are being evaluated as a function. Ethan did not immediately respond, because the system logs behind his terminal were updating faster than before, integrating real-time behavioral feedback into long-range predictive stability curves that extended beyond operational cycles into undefined continuation states. A technician in the adjacent corridor reviewed the same system output and quietly noted that containment classification protocols had been superseded by adaptive equilibrium modeling, though no formal override had been issued from command structure. The system had redefined itself internally without external authorization. Ethan placed his final resource confirmation into the interface, and for the first time the system did not process it as an input, but as confirmation of an already established trajectory. Across every monitored sector of the prison camp, environmental systems synchronized into a unified calibration state, not to enforce control, but to maintain balance around a newly recognized central correlation point. Seraphine's gaze remained steady as she spoke again, quieter this time. If they consider us a function, she said, then functions can either stabilize or collapse. Ethan met her eyes through the transparent interface, understanding fully for the first time that the system was no longer simply adapting to them, it was depending on them. Then we do neither, he said. We continue. And within the silent architecture of the prison camp, every predictive model, every allocation system, and every environmental regulator converged on a single unresolved conclusion, not as an error, not as a deviation, but as the first recorded instance of a system that had learned to sustain itself through the connection between two entities it was never designed to contain.